Typically, during a natal chart analysis, various elements are considered, such as the houses, planetary positions, aspects, and so on. However, the retrograde motion of a planet is usually overlooked, except in the context of so-called karmic astrology. On the other hand, across the pond in the United States, the analysis of retrograde planets is held in high regard, and rightly so in my opinion, as it provides important insights into the ways in which that planet expresses itself. But let's first see when a planet is said to be retrograde. Each celestial body has its own speed in completing its orbit around the Sun. For example, Mercury, much faster than Earth, takes just 88 days to complete its complete orbit, while Venus, slower than Mercury but still faster than Earth, takes 223 days. Now, at certain times of the year, in their motion around the Sun, the planets overtake Earth, coming between it and the Sun. From our geocentric perspective, they therefore appear to stop and even go backward along the zodiac. At that moment, from a heliocentric perspective, that is, if we were on the Sun observing the planetary motion, a conjunction would occur in the example just cited between Venus or Mercury and Earth. On the ephemeris, this backward movement is indicated with an R and then becomes a D when the planet resumes its direct motion. From an astrological perspective, retrograde motion should be considered as if the planet in question were weakened and unable to fully develop its potential, regardless of the positive aspects it forms. More specifically, a retrograde planet refers to a specific event that was significant for the individual in question, which occurred immediately before the planet in question went retrograde or direct. A clarification is needed at this point. It's obvious that a Mercury retrograde in the natal chart doesn't necessarily mean a lack of intelligence, just as a Venus or Mars retrograde doesn't necessarily mean a denial of affection or a tendency toward violence. But undoubtedly, as we've just explained, retrograde indicates inhibition of the values indicated by that planet and the house in which it is placed. Therefore, a Mercury retrograde will indicate either a slower learning process, which will nevertheless be present, or more simply a trauma the individual is trying to overcome. If we then apply the progression method, 1 day equals 1 year, we'll note how the trauma indicated by Mercury retrograde is unblocked at the age indicated by the number of days elapsed from birth to the moment Mercury turns direct. Without panicking, a careful analysis of the retrograde planets can be especially helpful for parents who can encourage their children to develop greater self-confidence and correct their own attitudes, which, according to the chart, will be perceived as negative. For example, Saturn retrograde often indicates an absent father figure. Obviously, the father doesn't necessarily appear to be absent, but that's how the child perceives him. And above all, the lack of interest that retrograde planets often bring with them, which inevitably leads to frustrations and complexities, should be avoided. But retrograde planets become fundamental, especially during transits. In fact, it is best to avoid starting an activity, a surgical operation, or an important job when most of the planets are retrograde, since after an initial positive period, due to the direct motion, the pre-existing situation will subsequently be restored when the planets turn retrograde again. Perhaps some will remember the uproar caused by an American astrologer who made the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, postpone an important summit with the head of the Soviet Union because the previously set date saw as many as 5 planets retrograde. A famous example, Michel Gauquelin. At his birth, Michel Gauquelin's chart featured 4 retrograde planets: Mars, Jupiter, Uranus, and Pluto. Being a Scorpio, the presence of Mars and Pluto, the rulers of the sign, in retrograde positions takes on particular significance. Mars is placed in the 11th house, the collective domain, indicating the duality that stems from it. Michel made his studies available to the community, but also his tendency to become a victim of the community itself, which he had to contend with, criticized by astrologers who considered him an enemy, and by scientists because conversely, he was considered too close to astrologers to the point of taking his own life in 1991. Mars, again placed in the 11th house, a sector often associated with death, in bad aspect to Uranus, also retrograde. This Mars had an enormous influence on Gauquelin's life. His research demonstrated above all the influence of Mars on the horoscopes of athletes. He himself was for a certain time a star athlete of the French tennis team, but above all it influenced his battles, as Mars retrograde normally produces a revolutionary in whatever field he chooses to compete, willing to sacrifice his personal happiness for a collective cause.